Good evening, afternoon, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV in what is our Christmas special, I suppose. It's the week of Christmas. I hope you're all ready for the festivities. I'm not, but there we go. So my guest this evening is Peter Lyon, who is going to here to talk about his book, American Saint Nick. And we just discussed the fact that I've got the very old version of the cover, and he's going to hold up the new one. So depending on whether you buy it online on Amazon or eBay, you'll get the new one. But the new one's better. So good evening, Peter. Are you okay? Are you well?
I am well. How about yourself?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good.
Good.
So let's begin. So we are talking about the events of December 1944, and I've done a few shows recently. And the thing I'm going to start with is it's an interesting time because there's a sense among some of the people in the ETO that things are winding down, that maybe we're going to get back for Christmas and the war's going to be over and the Germans are beaten and they're on the run, and people are a little bit more relaxed, and perhaps the urgency of June and July is a little bit past us. And your story concerns the 28th Division, and they have had an absolute hellish time in November and December, because they were in the Hürtgen forest. So before we get to this story, just kind of run down a little bit about how grim that was and how they've ended up in Luxembourg in December.
Absolutely. In fact, as you mentioned, this is a story about the 28th Infantry Division, and to appreciate, as you say, what they were going through and what happened, you have to take us back to the beginning of November for the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. And the Hürtgen Forest, it's a 50 square mile patch of land, straddles the German-Belgian border. And it was an absolutely horrific battle. It was an all-American battle, by the way. They were the only Allied troops committed to this thing. And what command had thought was that this 50 square mile patch of land would allow the Germans the absolute best staging area, and would allow them to amass troops and materiel for a counteroffensive, and perhaps also because it was a very heavily valleyed river, terrain, that they would blow the dams and flood the river valley, and thereby delay certainly the attack into Germany. And what this was, the Hürtgen Forest, was actually this sort of part three of this three-pronged pincer move, if you will, and they were the sort of the southern flank. So the Americans figured, we need to secure the Hürtgen Forest. So they went in there, and in early November, the 28th was committed to the Hürtgen Forest. Now, it was a defender's dream. It was, again, heavily ravined. The Germans, don't forget, for basically 6 to 8 years, had all that time to prep this area. They knew this would be a key part of the Siegfried line. So they had all this ample opportunity to just machine gun nests and minefields, and just any possible obstacle that they could throw at an attacking force, they did. And any attacking force would be fighting an uphill battle, which is what these U.S. troops were doing. And there were very few roads in the Hürtgen Forest. What was there were just logging roads. And because it rained virtually all the time there, the roads were very muddied and just and horribly imposing to any kind of vehicle traffic. So forget, this is no armor support or anything like that. This truly was an infantryman's battle. And in the early November, I believe it was November 2nd to be exact, they committed the 28th into this battle. And for the next 2 weeks, the 28th fought in the Hürtgen Forest, and the casualties were devastating. 2/3 of the division, now you're talking about, there were 9,000 guys, give or take, in a division. 2/3 of the division were casualties of this one battle in just this 2-week period. So this was an absolutely devastating battle for the 28th. And as you say, they were pulled out of the battle 2 weeks later and sent westward to R&R and to what was known as the quiet sector of Luxembourg. And now the 28th was spread throughout Luxembourg. Like the 110th Regiment ended up in Clairvaux, which is in the northern part of the country. And the 112th Regiment ended up sort of in the middle area where the town of Wiltz is. And Wiltz, as somebody noted once, was the headquarters for the 28th Infantry Division. It was a very small town, a very storybook looking town, but it served as headquarters for the 20th Infantry Division. And interestingly enough, it was also the headquarters of the German occupiers when they were in Luxembourg. So it's a very picturesque town. And part of the headquarters troop that was there was the Signal Company Message Center. And that's where our guys in this story were really from. They were from the Signal Company Message Center. Again, they'd been pulled out of this battle, sent to the rear. And so this was really downtime, some R&R time. Again, it was a quiet sector. Nobody was expecting anything to be going on. And truly, for the next month or so, nothing really did, or I should say next few weeks or so, nothing really did happen. It was just quiet time. Certainly the battle was still raging out in the Hürtgen, but here in Wiltz and the rest of Luxembourg, it was very quiet, peaceful time. And the soldiers actually had time to, again, as you say, think about maybe being home for Christmas. It was looking more and more grim that wasn't going to happen just by logistically and speaking. So they just figured we're probably going to be here. So they started getting used to the fact that they would be in this town and in this area for Christmas. And they became friendly with many of the locals. Now, this was also sort of a strange situation because command was saying, don't fraternize with the locals because, there may be some German sympathizers in there and stuff. And the men of the 28th quickly came to realize that couldn't be any further from the truth, because the people in Luxembourg absolutely hated their German occupiers. Now, a little bit more history here, if you don't mind,
please.
To appreciate what the Luxembourg people had gone through. In June of 1940, when the Germans swept through Europe and were heading into France, they obviously attacked what's known as the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. And in Luxembourg particularly, they didn't consider themselves occupiers so much as they considered themselves, they were annexing the people in Luxembourg. They were welcoming them back into the fatherland. And they set about this campaign to re-educate the population, to Germanize the population. And it was pretty intense. All the street names that had been, whatever they were, the Grand Rue or whatever, they were all changed to German street names. So a Grand Rue was gone. It now became Adolf Hitler Strasse or something like that. All official documents were now in German. German became the official language. It was illegal for the people of Luxembourg to speak their native language. And certain holidays and certain customs and traditions were outlawed if they were not sanctioned German holidays. St. Nicholas Day being one of them. Now, St. Nicholas Day is a town-wide celebration of the holiday season versus Christmas, which is more of a family celebration of the season. So, but it was not a sanctioned German holiday. So the Germans outlawed the celebration of St. Nicholas Day. And what really came to a head was in 1942 when the Germans began conscripting into the German army the Luxembourg youth 17 years and under. And at that point, Luxembourg people said, enough is enough. And they called a general strike. And the general strike began in Wiltz. And some of the organizers of this strike were teachers, well-respected teachers in the town of Wiltz. And as you would imagine, the Nazis really, they put down the rebellion, so to speak. The general strike came down very hard on the people, and all the strike organizers were rounded up, sent to the Hinzert concentration camp, and summarily executed. So even to this day, that general strike is remembered each and every year, and there is a monument in the center of Wiltz that is a monument to that general strike. So it's just important to understand that when the Allies came in and liberated Luxembourg, they were welcomed with open arms. So the thought of the Luxembourg people being sympathetic to the Germans couldn't be further from the truth. And I'm sure there were probably a few people who maybe were, but for the most part, they did not like the Germans. They did not want to have anything to do with them. So they were welcomed their liberators with open arms. So that's sort of the backstory that gets us back to these.
I think it's important to just, as you said, to have talked about Luxembourg a little bit, because I think of all the European countries, it's the one Americans and British and Canadians know the least about because of it, the small size. And yet the people of Luxembourg have had a long time to get used to being the small country that borders everybody else. They've learned how to kind of play the game and go, and kind of keep their heads down a little bit, fiercely independent as well. They're not German, they're not French, they're Luxembourg, and that's it. And so that's important. And And just going back to Hürtgen Forest, and just for those watching, we are going to eventually be doing a Hürtgen Forest panel discussion. I just haven't got around to organizing yet. We're going to talk about the 9th, the 28th, and everything. And it's an interesting thing because it doesn't really have a resolution, that battle. I know the 28th have left, but it kind of doesn't have that culminating sort of final battle of victory. It just sort of fizzles out and everything moves everywhere else. So it kind of gets overlooked a bit, which I think is a shame. And of course, we ought to mention, of course, it is part of how the 28th Division get their nickname converts from the Keystone, the Pennsylvania
Right.
Keystone, to the Bloody Bucket Division. An unfortunate nickname to earn, but as you said, because of just the incredible casualties they took there.
Sure.
So yeah, important to go. So we're back in the town of Wiltz, and you're talking about this relationship that's building up between the Americans and the civilians. And I also want to just jump in a little bit because there's other things on it. You know, you've done documentary. This is not your first rodeo with me today. I think a lot of the focus on the story we're going to be telling is about what it brought to the people of Wiltz. But I think it also brought a lot to the American participants because they have gone through this experience of the Hürtgen Forest. They're looking for a lift as well. They're looking for a moment of escapism, if you like, in between campaigns. I think I wanted to get that point across, that this story we're going to be telling is everyone benefited from it. I think really it was necessary to kind of just celebrate something. But anyway, I'll let you talk because it's your story.
No, you're Paul, you're absolutely right. And in fact, just to touch on that, you mentioned their shoulder patch, the red keystone from which is the Keystone State of Pennsylvania. That's their logo, and it was on the shoulder patch. It was the Germans that gave them the nickname, the Bloody Bucket Division, because after the Hürtgen, and the Germans couldn't understand why the Americans were committing all these soldiers and all these divisions to this battle. They just couldn't understand it. I mean, they kept fighting, but they couldn't understand it. And so severe were the casualties and so beaten up with the 28th that they thought the red shoulder patches looked like buckets of blood. So it was just very, and the Bloody Bucket Division is what they became, nicknamed as. But you're right about the soldiers. In fact, as we go through the story, one soldier in particular, he befriends somebody in town, a guy named Martin Schneider. This one soldier befriends this guy, Martin Schneider, and Martin starts telling him about the way life was under Nazi rule and how the Luxembourg people, again, fiercely independent, were not allowed to speak their language. Their flag was outlawed. Their surnames were changed. Anything that had a French sounding surname, if your name was had some French name, it was changed to a German name. So there were literally histories of families that were potentially wiped out simply because their names disappeared. I mean, that's what they were looking at. And so this one particular soldier, his name is Harry Stutz. He hears about all this, and in particular, he hears how there is Harry Stutz, and he hears about how the Germans forbade the Luxembourg people from celebrating St. Nicholas Day, and he just and he couldn't understand why they would be forbidden from celebrating a holiday that was really about the children. It's sort of like a combination of Halloween and Christmas and Thanksgiving all balled into one, and it was really a children's holiday where the kids would put their little shoes out on the doorstep, and the next day they'd be filled with treats and stuff like that. But all that was outlawed, and while he couldn't understand why, he got to know a little bit of the background behind the story, and was like, well, wait a minute, maybe there's something that we can do. I mean, we're the U.S. Army, maybe we can help them celebrate St. Nicholas Day. Now, you have to remember, for nearly 5 years, they'd not been able to celebrate this holiday of St. Nicholas Day. Here they are, liberated, and although they were free to celebrate it, they really had nothing with which to celebrate. I mean, there were no chocolates and candies and sweets and treats. There was nothing like that, simply because of the depravity of war. So again, Harry's thinking, we should be able to do something for them. So he convinces the cooks to make donuts and cookies and everything like that. And he convinces all these soldiers to donate stuff from their packages, from their care packages from home, and their rations and all that stuff. So he's gathering all these things. Now, what makes this even more interesting, I think, is that here's Harry Stutz running around trying to organize this St. Nicholas party, this St. Nicholas holiday that he really doesn't know anything about, because Harry's Jewish. He doesn't know anything about St. Nicholas Day. He doesn't even know much about Catholicism, but he finds out by going to the local priest and saying, well, what's this holiday all about? So the priest starts telling him a little bit of the background and then says, well, if you're really serious about this, you should go talk to the teachers in the school, because they're the ones that will get the word out and have and have an idea of how to go about this. So he does. He goes to the teachers. Now remember, go back to the strike in 42. Some of those organizers were teachers. So not only were they surprised that, oh yeah, we're going to have St. Nicholas Day celebration of some kind, but also, oh my gosh, they're going to have a big party about this. And so they were completely thrown by this, just completely surprised, but said, okay, let's go ahead and celebrate this. And they agreed on December 5th as the day they would have this party, if you will. Now, December 6th is actually St. Nicholas Day, but they thought, with it being their first time having everything, maybe we'll have it on the 5th and we can coordinate it all better. So okay, so Harry, and this is where your point about the morale thing for the U.S. troops comes in, because Harry basically has to get clearance through the chain of command, which he does, and General Dutch Coda, the commander of the 28th, thinks this would be a great idea, be great for morale, great for the troops who, they knew they weren't going to be home for Christmas. So yeah, why not throw this little party? And even commissioned the printing of invitations to this party. So he got the blessing of high command to go ahead and do this. And he had gotten the local printers in town, and he had gotten a few of his friends together to form what was like this Christmas committee to go around, and each had various assignments. Again, talk to the cooks, collect what you can from other soldiers, and organize what you can with invitations, and how are we going to work this? And there was one crucial element that he needed to make this whole thing work, and that was he needed one soldier to play St. Nicholas. So he gets the idea, well, I'll go to my roommate and my really good friend, Richard Brookins, and I'll ask him to be St. Nicholas. I'm sure he'll do it. And he does. And he goes and he asks Richard to be St. Nicholas, and Richard says no. Get somebody else to do it. And the reason Richard says no is simply because he thought, oh my God, if this is going to be such a big event, again, it's got the blessing of Coda, and it's, everybody in town's going to be there. He was afraid he was going to do something to screw it up, and it would be remembered all right, but for all the wrong reasons. But Harry, kept working on him, and finally, Richard says, "Okay, yeah, I'll do it. Sure. What do I need to do?" So Harry says, "Okay, well, you got to go up to the Wiltz Castle, which is this little sprawling chateau on the end of town, and you got to meet with the nuns up there. They've got this costume for you." And Richard's like, "A costume? What are you talking about?" And I was like, well, yeah, of course you have to wear a costume. You got to dress up. You got to dress the part. You're not going to just, what are you going to walk around with a beard and a helmet? No, you got to. So they get him in a Jeep and they drive him up to the Wiltz Castle. And sure enough, there are these nuns with this costume. And what the costume is, it's basically the priest's vestments for saying mass. And it's his mass robes, his gloves. They have as you see in this photo here, he's got a crozier, which is basically like a shepherd's staff. It was held together with a piece of tape. You can actually see the piece of tape at the very top of that crozier. Yeah, yeah. And they have a bishop's mitre that they made for him, and it was just way too tight, but he put it on anyway. And they had this beard, and you can see the beard there, and it was fashioned out of rope. And it was this heavy, thick, just itchy, gnarly hunk of rope, but it was the best they could do in the circumstances.
It isn't the most convincing costume you've ever seen in your life, is it? I mean, let's be honest. It's
not the most.
The thought counts, but
But I'll tell you, what was interesting was it was good enough to fool the children of Wiltz, which is all it really needed, because, like Richard would have told you that. He still didn't think anyone knew he was a GI. Once he got all the garb on and everything, aside from his boots sticking out from underneath, there was really nothing to indicate that he was a U.S. soldier. He even knew a few words of German. He had studied it in high school. So he knew a little bit of German, enough to get by and, ask the kids their name and, things like that. So, it was a very convincing role for him. So what they did is they got him all dressed up and they put him in a Jeep and they drove to the boys' school in the center of town. So and part of this was a twofold thing. They wanted to include the boys' school in the center of town, but also to bring everybody back to the Wiltz Castle, which is where this party was going to be. And at the party, they would have skits, and they would have songs, and there would be hot chocolate being, you know, melted down D-bars from the soldiers' rations, made hot chocolate. So they're having this party back at the Wiltz Castle, but they wanted to go to town first, in the center of town, so everybody could see that St. Nicholas was back. And then they did this little procession through town, and they ended up coming back to Wiltz and coming back to the Wiltz Castle, that is, and driving through the castle portal. And we actually have video film from 1944 of the actual event of the Jeep coming through the castle portal, and then Richard getting out and greeting all these children that had gathered around
which we're going to play now. We'll and I don't know how juddery it is. My internet connection is terrible this week, but we'll play it, and you can carry on talking over it. So and you can find this on YouTube, folks. It's there, and yeah. So talk us through it, Paul.
Yeah, this is the, you know, Richard Brookins in the Jeep. There's Keith Burton driving. And if you keep watching just a minute, you'll actually see Harry Stutz in the background. He's right there. There you see Harry Stutz. He's walking in the background, supervising everything. And here he is. This is Richard Brookins in this, you know, the castle courtyard, and all these children. They're performing all these skits and all these songs, and everything is to welcome St. Nicholas back into town. And Richard, of course, he's playing the part. In fact, he even says that, you know, once he started again, he was just a big kid having fun. He didn't want it to end. Nobody wanted it to end. Everybody looked like they were having a good time. And what the soldiers had done is they collected all these treats and everything from from everybody in the unit. And they put together little gift bags to make sure every child had something that they could take away from this party, a little gift bag. And these things are called Tischen, and that's the name they give them. And they're just little like candy gift bags full of treats, and you know they were just gum and, you know, little sweets and candies. And every child that was at here, and they're probably, as you can see, they're probably like, you know, 30, 40 kids here, got something from St. Nicholas, and they got to talk to St. Nicholas and tell them what they wanted for Christmas, etc. And again, everybody was having such a great time. And I think what's one of the interesting side notes, and you know, and again, this story, you know, when you read the book, it's got so many, there's so many tidbits to it that sometimes you read it and you go, he must have made that up, or that's writer embellishment or something. But no, actually, it is actually, the subtitle of the book is a true story, simply because everything in it is true.
Yeah.
In fact, the reason we see this video here, and this is one of the fascinating sidebars of the story, is that there were two combat cameramen who were out on assignment that day. And they were filming a bombing run in the Roar River Valley and 9th Infantry troop movements into Germany. And they were on their way back into town, and they were about to, you know, they were done for the day. They were going to drop off their film at headquarters, and that was it. And as they come into town, and again, Wiltz is a very small town. There was basically one road in, one road out. They're coming into town, and they're about to take a left on the Rue de Tondeur, which would have taken them right to headquarters, right to the front door of headquarters. And as they're about to make that turn, they see coming out of the Wiltz Castle portal a Jeep with what looks like Santa Claus hanging off the back. Now, that's not something you see in the European theater of operation all too often. So the curiosity gets the better of them, and they follow the Jeep, and they end up down at the boys' school, where they find out, there's going to be a party back at the castle. Sure, we'll go back there and set up our equipment. We got some extra film on the roll. Let's film this, and they do, and so they start filming all the events you're seeing here. Now, what's interesting is that they were not assigned to do this. They were told to do it. They just did it on their own because they thought it'd be just a neat thing to catalog and to have video of, or film of at the time. And what I love to do is to extrapolate from this and think about, what if they entered into town 30 seconds earlier or 30 seconds later than they actually did? They would have missed the Jeep coming out of the castle portal, and we would not have this video. And when you read the book and I'm describing the party, for a writer, this was easy. All I had to do is describe what I'm seeing on the film. This is, there you go. Richard walking around and greeting the kids, you know, they're passing out donuts. You know, there's a girl like singing a song. I mean, it made this part of my job very easy. just to describe what was happening here. And and I mean, I'm still fascinated by this video every time I see it. If you think about, again, the sheer luck and coincidence that went into just
amazing
capturing this moment.
Well, I played it through a couple of times today, and what was interesting to me is looking at it again. is the people of the town have leapt into the joy of it very, very quickly. Some of the Americans, you can tell they're still dealing with the trauma of the Hürtgen forest. They're there, but you can sense they're not quite ready to kick their heels up completely. They do it a bit, but there's some in the background they're still kind of deer in the headlights in a sense, and completely get that. They've been through a pretty awful ordeal. I mean, they've been fighting since Normandy. They've gone all the way. So you can understand that it's going to take a while for them to kind of come out and find their kind of party selves, I suppose. But yeah, it's a fascinating bit of footage. And we had a question saying how much of their rations did they have to share? Or were they able to get some extras from headquarters?
Oh, as I say, the company cooks were happy to donate whatever they could. So I think we just saw, the kids had donuts to eat, and there were cookies, there were all sorts of things, and there was no shortage of people willing to donate once they realized what was going on, and they just gave whatever they could. Richard was like, I'll give whatever, take what you need.
This we've switched to we'll talk about that later. In fact, I'll pause that now because let's talk about the well, in fact, we'll end that. We'll bring that in a minute later.
Yeah.
So this was obviously an amazing event. You can sense what it is for the people of the town, as you say. Several years of not so much hardship, but just the regime, the rule changes, and there's suddenly these Americans who are kind of throwing the rule book out the window and say, "Yeah, of course you can do Saint Nick. What's the problem? Yeah,
right.
That will feed you." And you can, they've just embraced it.
Absolutely.
So, but of course, let you tell the story, but there is the downward turn of the fact that the events of the middle of December kick in. But I'll let you carry on.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. In fact, as soon as this party was done, when it was over, and we saw at the very end there was Richard in the room taking off the bishop's mitre. Interesting side note there was that the mitre was so tight on his head that he had this splitting headache the entire time he was there meeting the kids. It was a pounding headache. And at one point, Harry came up to him and said, "Hey, Saint Nick, how's it going?" And Richard said, "I've got this terrible headache, and it's from this hat that's too tight." So Harry says, "Well, take it off." And he refused to do it because he knew that doing so would sort of break the illusion for the children. And he didn't want to do it. So he was like, "I'll be fine." So, but he had
must go on at this point. Yeah,
pretty much. Yeah. And but it just showed how dedicated these guys were to just making their lives, these children's lives, better as in any simple way that they could. And this is what they were doing. But then you mentioned, okay, so this was December 5th. And once the party was over, life went on. They had their jobs to do. And Richard's job was going into headquarters each and every day, as was Harry's. And their job was to work at the message center, encoding and decoding messages on what was known as the Sagaba machine, which is sort of like the American version of the Enigma. So that's what they were. They were encoders and decoders. But one of Richard's side jobs in the Army was that he was a projectionist. He showed films to the soldiers, usually training films, sometimes Hollywood feature films. And that's what he did. When he got to Wiltz after the Hürtgen, his equipment was there, and he didn't have it in the Hürtgen, obviously, but his equipment was there. And one of his assignments was he was put on what's called TD, temporary duty, to go up to Clairvaux, which is where the 110th, as I mentioned earlier, which is where the 110th was stationed. And his assignment was to show movies or films to the soldiers of the 110th and anybody else who was on R&R up in Clairvaux. And at the time, the only film that he had was the film Going My Way, the Bing Crosby classic, Christmas classic. And so he was sent up there on temporary duty to do that. And he arrived in there on the evening of December 15th, dropped his equipment off. They dropped his equipment off. He checked into a hotel there. They assigned him a room in a hotel. Went down, got some chow, and went up and basically went to bed around 10 o'clock or whatever. And about 5 a.m, he's rocked out of bed at first, sound sleep, you think it's thunder, but in the middle of December. And he realized it's artillery shells landing in Clairvaux. This is the very early stages of the Battle of the Bulge. This is December 16th now. In the morning is December 16th. So Richard is front and center for this attack. And Clairvaux, interestingly enough, had 2 bridges that crossed the Clairvaux River that were wide enough and strong enough to support armored vehicles and allow the Germans pretty much a straight paved shot to this crossroads town known as Bastogne. So they really wanted to take Clairvaux. Now, nobody knew this at the time. Of course, it was chaos. It was insanity. Nobody knew what kind of attack was happening, what strength, where it was. And Richard, being front and center in Clairvaux, was right at the heart of it. And he spent the next, that day, first as a messenger. He was assigned a messenger from the 110th commander to go back and forth to town because communications had been cut. And then basically was told, I know you want to get back to your unit in Wiltz, but you're on your own. So he and another soldier were basically on their own to get out of Clairvaux, which they did, but just ahead of the Germans who were coming into town. And in fact, one of the side notes was that as they were going through town to try to get out of it, they ran across and literally almost stumbled across a couple of Germans setting up a machine gun post. And Richard acted, more quickly than Germans, and he ended up killing both those Germans and allowing them to further escape Clairvaux. So that's just part of what was happening, after the party. Don't forget, there was still a war going on. There was still a war to fight. And in the Battle of the Bulge that ensued, the 28th Infantry Division were forced to withdraw westward. And again, first they were going to go to Bastogne. That was their initial rally point, but obviously couldn't go there because of the German onslaught, and it kept going further and further west. So they retreated from Wiltz and from Luxembourg. And once again, Luxembourg fell under German control. And it was not like it was early in 1940. The Germans weren't there to take control of Luxembourg. They were trying to plow through Luxembourg. As we know, they were on their way, trying to get to the town of Antwerp and to Bastogne. So Luxembourg is at this point a stepping stone, to their ultimate battle plan.
Yeah, it's just in the way, isn't it? It's just in the way of the goal. Yeah.
Right. It wasn't. So this was not like they weren't occupying at this time. This was like they were just barreling through, and in the process, up to that point, the town of Wiltz and most of Luxembourg was pretty much untouched by the damage of war, and that all changed after the Battle of the Bulge. In fact, Wiltz was all but destroyed. Like 80% of the town was leveled in the bombing that ensued after the Germans had overrun them. The town had to be bombed so they could clear the Germans out. Sadly, some of the children who were at this St. Nicholas party were killed by that bombing, which was, by Allied bombing. And even so, the town of Wiltz and the people there vowed when the war was over that they would never forget the kindness and generosity of that handful of American soldiers that one St. Nicholas Day. And they vowed that they would, from then on, do what they could to remember those soldiers. And so, and this is where the story gets, again, it's still fascinating. What they did is they said, we're going to now incorporate a new tradition into our St. Nicholas celebration. And that would be somebody from the town be chosen and it'd be a great honor to be not just St. Nicholas, but to be the American St. Nicholas.
The American playing St. Nick. Yeah, exactly.
And they would, and what they did is they decided they would include this new parade, just like the soldiers did during the war. And they would parade St. Nicholas, or the American St. Nicholas, through town, just like the soldiers did during the war, and end up at the Wiltz Castle for a party for the children, just like the soldiers did during the war. And they did this faithfully. They recreated this faithfully for 30 years. And on the 30th anniversary of the rebuilding of the town, they decided we want to do something special. And they thought, what if we could find those soldiers who were here for the original party and bring them back to recreate their roles? And that's basically the story and how it unfolds for finding Richard Brookins and Harry Stutz and everybody else. And they didn't know whether these soldiers were alive or dead. They had no way of knowing. They tried. There was one particular person in town, Gene Schweig, who was sort of like the ringleader of all this. And he tried desperately to find these soldiers, and he tried every means possible, but was just running into brick wall after brick wall after brick wall, until one day a former MP, military police, assigned to the 28th, was reliving his war years and was going through Wiltz because he was actually one of the defenders. He volunteered to stay behind to cover the withdrawal during the Battle of the Bulge, and was ultimately captured and remained a POW to the end of the war. But he was reliving his war years and was going through Wiltz. And this guy, Gene Schweig, and one other member of the town met him and were talking to him and said, do you want to come see our castle. And at the castle, we have a museum dedicated to all those who fought here. And he said, oh yeah, sure. Why not? So they go to the castle, and when he's there, they point to these pictures on the wall and they say, you see that soldier there playing St. Nicholas. And he said, that's a soldier. And he said, well, yeah, no, he's Richard Brookins. He was in your division. You probably know him. Again, a division's 9,000 guys.
Yeah.
Frank didn't know that the MP's name was Frank McClellan. And he, of course, didn't know Richard, but Gene Schweig was very persuasive and convinces Frank to go home and see if he can find Richard Brookins. Maybe there's some way that he could do it to whatever. And that's basically how the story is told. It starts off with Frank going back in 1977 to relive his war years, and how he ends up finding Richard Brookins, which in itself is a fascinating sidebar story, and how he finds Richard.
Yeah, and I mean, just to your credit, there's so many rabbit holes you could have gone down in your book that you step into a bit and you kind of outline where that rabbit hole could go, but you kind of go back and go, yeah, no, we're going to keep on with it. Otherwise, the book would be 14 inches thick and you never get through it. And I just wanted to just hold up there for a second before we continue, because particularly for the Americans and British watching this, our countries weren't occupied, although I always mentioned the Channel Islands. Yes, they were, but let's just look at this town of Wiltz and what they went through, because the Germans were there for years. And yes, sure, they took away these people from the general strike, and they killed them, and they changed. You couldn't fly your flags, you couldn't play your radios, and you changed the street names, stuff like that. But it wasn't a violent occupation in that sense. And then when the Americans had to drive the Germans out after Battle, they used shells, they used air power, they used destruction, and it is American shelling that actually does it in for a lot of these civilians. But their immediate thought is not any kind of anger against the Americans or the Allies. It's immediately, let's honor the Americans who gave us that moment to celebrate our town and celebrate St. Nick. And I think it's just worth just sort of stopping and pausing and underlining that for a second, because that to me symbolizes everything about the difference between what the Allies were trying to achieve and what the Third Reich was trying to achieve. We had to use violence in order to get rid of a greater enemy. And in these cases, the same applies in France and Belgium. You get these occasions where the Allies were destructive. We were getting rid of a horrible enemy. I just wanted to sort of stop and just address that point and hammer it home that these people could have harbored anger against us, but they actually channeled that sadness, and just remind of people watching, some of the kids you saw, those faces you saw in that film, they were dead within a few days of that, and that's tragic. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that up there because I just think it's a really important point. So the color footage of the film is that 1977, isn't it? I think
that's 1977. That's when Richard goes back there. And again, just as a quick sidebar, the way Frank finds Richard is that he goes to a reunion, and he realizes that there's a guy that in his National Guard reunion that works for the phone company, and he says, I'm going to give this guy Dave Kelly a call and say, hey Dave, do you know this guy? Can you help me find him? He knew the name Richard Brookins and Rochester, New York. They're the only two things he knew. So he calls him up and he says, I got a favor to ask you. And David Kelly's like, we can't, we're not allowed to really do that, with our phone company computers, but let me see what I can do. Give me the guy's name. And he says, okay, his name is Richard Brookins, Broo. And Dave Kelly says, Brookins, like Richard Brookins? Message Center says, yeah. He goes, I know him. I trained him how to use the Sagaba. So that's how they actually find him. They're like, oh my God, what a coincidence. Of all the people he could call, he calls the one guy who was Dick Brookins' trainer on using the Sagaba, the encoding device. So, great. That's terrific. And Frank sends the information back to Luxembourg, and Gene Schweig writes Richard Brookins an 8-page letter explaining to him that for the last 30 years, now it's important to remember, just as you said, once the party was over and the battle ensued, That was it. I mean, they didn't go back to Wiltz. The 28th had assignments, took them elsewhere. They were up in the Alsace-Lorraine region, the Colmar region. They never went back to town. And frankly, they forgot all about the party. It was just it was one day. It was a great act of kindness. But after that, life went on. Life in the war went on. And then of course, the war ends and everybody goes home and they start building their lives. But the people in Wiltz and the people in Luxembourg never forgot. And so, this guy, Gene, writes to Richard and says, for the past 30 years, we've been honoring you and celebrating what you did. And again, just trying to remember the kindness that you guys showed to these children that one day. And we were just wondering if you would come back and do it again. And Richard said it didn't take long for him to think about it and say yes. And then he wanted his whole family to go over. And sure enough, the film that you were just showing, the color version, is from 1977. And this time, he's not in a Jeep. He gets into, well, at that point he wasn't in a Jeep. He arrives in the town in a helicopter, and it's not just 30 kids now. Now there's more like 3,000 kids, because everybody, not in just Wiltz, but in all the surrounding towns and most of Luxembourg, heard about this soldier that was coming back and what had happened during the war, and that they were going to repeat their roles as St. Nicholas. And sure enough, Harry was there and Frank McClellan was there. So all the soldiers that they could find that had been part of this Christmas committee and part of putting this little Christmas party or St. Nicholas party on were all there 30 years later. And now what's interesting, I keep saying what's interesting because it all is that to this very day, now this is the only year because of COVID that this has not happened, but every year since, what they do is that, the parade route has changed slightly because some streets are now closed to pedestrian only traffic, et cetera, et cetera. But they still have the parade that goes through town. And now St. Nicholas is on a big parade float with not just 2 angels, but with like 6 angels. And they still pass out treats as they go along the parade route. But to this day, the parade goes down through the middle of town and curls around in front of the Wiltz Castle, right in front of that castle portal that we've seen in that film. Yeah. And St. Nicholas comes off the parade float, gets into a vintage World War II Jeep, and they drive him through that castle portal to recreate that moment from 1944. And they do it every year religiously. And it's just, when they do it, it's the cameras roll, everyone's taking photographs. And if you think about it, it really touches you. Like to this day, they're still remembering to do this, to honor these.
Well, it's so much more than just the event, isn't it? The event itself is kind of simple, but it's symbolic of something much greater, isn't it? It's the event itself. If people have just happened to stumble upon that clip on YouTube, it's like a guy in a rather cheesy costume, and there's a guy in a Jeep, and it's fine. It's a little interlude in World War II. Yeah, it's the whole where it sits in the context of what these people went through, what the 28th have been through, what even people like Kota. You mentioned Kota sort of getting permission. Kota, let's not go down the rabbit hole of that. But Kota did incredibly well at Normandy with the 29th Division and as assistant divisional commander, get to 28th, and he doesn't come out of the Hürtgen forest terribly well in a lot of kind of big critical studies and things. And I kind of would agree that it wasn't his finest hour. However, he's a human being who cares about his men. He cares about the people, and it's an act of almost redemption for him in a sense that kind of and when people, there was a big debate on Twitter today about the last couple of days about General Haig in the First World War. He's a barbarian, he's a murderer, and you go, these are human beings, for Christ's sake. These are people who are, they've got consciences, they've got brains that they function. Kota doesn't want to lose men under his command. He didn't do anything deliberately. He was battling in a terrible area against the well dug in Germans defending their homeland, and sure, it didn't go particularly well, but give the guy a break, for goodness sake. He's a human being and he deserves our respect, and all these guys do. So I've got to ask you, Peter, how the hell did you find this story for yourself? I mean, you're living in Connecticut now, but where did you discover the story of a small town in Luxembourg?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. Actually, I was, at the time I discovered the story, I was living in Pittsburgh, and I was working with a guy. His name is Terry Brookins. And Terry Brookins is one of Richard Brookins' sons. And Terry was saying to me, hey, I'm going to be going on vacation with my family in November. We're going to go to Luxembourg. And at the time, I didn't know a lot about Luxembourg, but I knew November in Luxembourg is going to be cold, rainy, probably snowing. Why don't you take him to Disney World or something? Why are you going to Luxembourg? And he goes, oh, well, I got to go over there, going over there for this thing my dad did during the war. And I was like, and I've always had a fascination with all things World War II. I have 4 uncles that fought in the war. So I've always had a fascination with it. And I said, well, what did he do? And he says, you really want to know? I said, yeah. So Terry gave me the thumbnail version of this story. And when he was done, I was gobsmacked. I was just like, oh my gosh, what an amazing story. And he's like, no, all those guys have stories like that. I'm like, no, Terry, this is awesome. This is a great story. Somebody should tell this story.
And you're a journalist. You're a
Yeah.
journalist first, aren't you? You're
Right.
a journalist, kind of part-time historian, but it's a journalist. And you clearly, the moment you got that thumbnail version, the idea of story just must have hit you like a bulldozer,
Oh, it did. And Paul, honestly, this is before I started finding out all the little sidebars about it. The more I dove into it and the more I found out and the more I talked to these guys and did the interviews and everything, I mean, it became just more and more, as you say, there's so many more rabbit holes and more encompassing. And I was, as I was writing it, I'm thinking, this is almost like people aren't going to believe this, because there's just, you had to have the amazing confluence of personnel, timing, coincidence, luck, just everything had to happen at exactly the right moment and right time. And it did. And it continues. And this is the story. And again, as I was researching, writing, I thought, this can't be real. I mean, this is Hollywood. Actually, if you presented this to somebody in Hollywood, they would probably reject it, saying that's too fanciful. But
too many convenient plot devices there to
right.
move. The coincidences are just through the roof in this one. I mean, and I'm gonna big you up. I like to big up all my guests. And I've got 1,200 books, and I'm reading them all the time now for the various shows I've got coming up. And I reread your one, and it's good to read a book like yours in amongst those big, serious 600-page studies about battles, because it just ends up getting a little bit, so it's a flanking attack again. And it just reminds you a little bit of what we were fighting for and what the human beings went through and what the civilians went through. And it's still World War II. You still explain the battles. You still talk about the combat as well. And, you've only done a potted version tonight of what these men went through. And there's escapades and, there's other things that go on there. But it is kind of a break from the sort of overly scholarly battlefield assessment type book to something a little bit more uplifting, a little bit more so human interest.
Sure. And right, you're absolutely right. It's like sometimes and we've all been there, read those books, that it can be very dry, and it's like it can be tough going to get through them and stuff. And certainly Saint Nick is full of facts, and you have to remember, when somebody would say something to me or tell me a detail, for instance, when Richard was in Clairvaux, he would say, oh, when I was getting ready to leave, I stood outside and the sun was on my face. And you're thinking, the sun, wait a minute, the Battle of Bulge was all snowy and blizzard. What happened to all that? And it was important to, again, you're getting these firsthand accounts, people who were there. And at the very start of the Bulge, again, December 15th, 16th, 17th, in that window, yes, it was the weather, the front was coming in and it was overcast, but actually during the day on the 16th, the sun was actually out. It was actually not a bad day over, cold. But I mean, you don't realize that until you start doing the research, and you're like, okay, the heavy snows came a few days later.
Said the snow came later. The Malmedy massacre was not in snow. The snow you see at the battlefield afterwards with the dead, that was snow. But yeah, the first part of the stage it wasn't great weather. It was still the winter, but there was sun, and there was and we have this image of Battle of the Bulge must be snowy, unless it's in the 1965 movie, in which case it's fought in a desert. But let's not go down
completely open.
The Ardennes in Spain. Anyway, let's not go down that rabbit hole. But,
but I mean, I think it's important to note that, because that's the point. It's like, when you read a book, you're going to be like, hey, wait a minute, that didn't happen, because it's no. If I'm going to believe somebody, I'm going to believe the guy that was standing there in town when the bombs were falling versus some accounting that I may have read in a book. No. Like this guy's telling me this is what it was like, and he ought to know he was there. So there's a lot of that personal detail that yes, we talk about the Hürtgen, and yes, we talk about Colmar, and we talk about the Bulge, and certainly all those elements that we touch upon in the book, but there's also, or that I touch upon in the book, but there's also the personal accounts of those battles and what it was like during that time, and what for these soldiers, particularly what it was like in those battles. And I think that's important to realize that,
Yeah.
again, this is their, Harry Stutz, when the Bulge starts, is digging a hole to bury his ID and and anything that would, his dog tags, anything would identify him as being a Jew in case he was captured. And those are the things, you don't necessarily get. And when you're right, you get your 600 page, book that has all, again, it's very highly detailed, but sometimes
you lose your cast of characters, don't you, to some extent. You just get, and you need those books, and they're great.
Absolutely.
I mean, Peter Caddigadham's Snow and Steel, fantastic book, probably the definitive book in the Battle of the Bulge. But the cast of characters is thousands. Your cast of characters is a dozen or whatever it is, and so you can get to know them, and it's him again. Oh, there's the Luxembourg, there's the priest, there's the guy, there's the Jew, the Jewish guy from so and so. And you fall along with it, and it's easy to follow, and it's about storytelling, and that's your journalistic background makes for a good story. And of course, we will bring you back again at some point to talk about Merg, your other story, which is another great American story in the ETO. But we'll do that some other time. But are you working on anything else World War II right now, or what are you working on genuinely at the moment?
Well, actually, what's happening right now is, as you mentioned, Merg is being it's already been translated into Luxembourgish, and that was released in August, so that's still happening. And in next year, turn of the new year, we'll have Merg released in German. So we're kind of working on that. I have a translator who's over there who's working on that, and that's an ongoing process right now. So,
and just give us a 30-second thumbnail sketch of that so that people can get excited about you coming back on. Just promo time.
Merg is another story, and in fact, I found out about Merg while doing research for American St. Nick, and it was Dick Brookins who said, "Did I ever, tell you about the story about that church in this town called Eschweiler?" And I said, "No." So Eschweiler is a small farming village that's 4 miles north of Wiltz, and there's a church there, St. Mauritius. It is the only church in the world dedicated to a single American soldier. And that soldier was George Mergenthaler, whose grandfather was the inventor of the linotype. He was an only son, heir to the family fortune, which was vast. It was an incredible family fortune. And that church is the only church in the world dedicated to a single American soldier. His name was George Mergenthaler. And George was in that town of Eschweiler when the Battle of the Bulge broke out, and was sadly killed in action 2 days later. And it's his story that we're bringing to life through the book Merg. That was his nickname. And when you read it, you'll understand why it becomes so important.
We'll do that another time. Because we will, and I promise we will. And so we're going to kind of bring things to an end now because we are. And it's been absolutely a pleasure talking to you, Peter. And
you as well.
Great. Thank you very much. It's been good. And in terms of those watching, I've actually got a few days off for that Christmas thing. But our next live show, December the 27th, 7 a.m. UK time, we're bringing you a live stream from Hong Kong for the fighting of 1941. Look, there's a promo going on. There's a book coming up there, and good present. You probably might if you order it tomorrow, you might just about get it in time for Christmas. It's definitely worth getting, folks. And what can I say? It's been perfect show tonight. So for those watching, of course, please do remember to click subscribe, click the little bell to get notifications, check out Peter's website, sign up with us on Patreon so you can get more of these, join in with what we're doing on World War II TV. But until I see you after Christmas, I'm going to wish all my viewers who've stuck with me since June a very Merry Christmas, or whatever, happy holidays, whatever faith or not faith you are, whatever you want to celebrate. You have a good time, and we'll see each other on the other side of the Christmas day. So December 27th, Hong Kong. Then we've got a Star Wars special interview with the Pearl Harbor survivor, loads of things coming up. So thank you very much, everybody, for watching. I'll see you all again. Peter, hang around for a second as I'm going to speak to you for a bit, but we'll end the stream, and I'll see you all again very soon. Thank you very much for watching.
Cheers all.